Good morning. Welcome. Welcome one and all to this gathering. This is a time and place where we seek to be open to all that is before us, to our connection to each other, that's why we're talking so much, to all creation, all creatures, all life, recognizing our oneness with each other, with the universe, that we are in it and it is in us. We meet today to ponder the miracle of the seasons, the miracle of the turning of winter into spring, the miracle of our turning from difficulty to possibility, the miracle of life, really. And we do so together as a community that comes together to gather in this place week upon week. And we're welcome. If we've been ones that have been here in weeks past, we're welcome. If we're one that is here for the first time, there's a place for you and you're welcome. We do so as we gather this morning, we gather on this land that many have called home, and we acknowledge particularly the history and the culture and the spirituality of the First Nations and Métis people with whom we signed Treaty 6 and Treaty 8, and wherein our church resides. We honor the gifts that affords us, which are many. We recognize this week in and week out after many years and many generations where we did not recognize this. And so we do so, and we recognize the gifts that it gives us in the way in which we continue to work together, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal alike, to be stewards of this land. So we gather in that spirit of partnership, and we come together also in song to welcome the new day that has dawned on this land and in our lives and in our sights. Let's sing together. As we center ourselves this morning, you'll see a phrase before us, and it says, "May our eyes be opened." May that be our response to each of the phrases that I offer into the space this morning. In the beauty of this new spring morning, may our eyes be opened. In this hour together as community, may our eyes be opened. On this step along our spiritual journey, may our eyes be opened. In the unfolding of strength, of beauty, of love, of spirit, may our eyes be opened. And this morning, in the words we speak, in the values we share, and in the songs we sing, may our eyes be opened. We meet together on the ground of openness. And so we light this candle this morning as we do each time we gather. The the light that reminds us of the light of possibility that shines within us and around us. We light this candle too to remind us of the mystery of spirit that we embrace within us and that continues to be the hope of our quest. And we light this candle that reminds us of all that is sacred. As it burns in our midst this morning, may it be our center and be our grounding. As we move from getting here to being here, may this light and this music bring us fully to this place and this time. Let's join our voices together as we pray our intentions for this morning and for our day ahead. In the midst of the muddle and the miracle of living, we are here to celebrate. We seek to empower our living with the evolving wisdom of the ages, with a vision shaped by beauty, justice, and truth. We trust that for every beauty, there are eyes to see it. For every truth, there are ears to hear it. For every injustice, there are hearts and hands to confront it. In being here, we seek to strengthen our intention to be part of that kind of seeing and hearing, that kind of feeling and doing. May it be so. We are fortunate this morning, as we are every spring, to have with us Carolyn McDade, author, writer, musician, composer, keeper and seeker of spiritual wisdom. And so we welcome her this morning as she leads us in some of the music that we will sing this morning. And so with Carolyn at the piano, we continue to join together in song this morning. Our time for all ages this morning is a time when anyone's welcome to come up to the carpet. And this morning, we're going to also welcome our friend Sherry Ann to teach us some signs, all of us, some signs to a song. Has anyone seen any signs of spring? Anyone seen anything outside that looks like spring? What do you see, Liam? The grass is pretty beautiful. What's happening to it?
It's starting to die, and new grass will come.
Yes, new grass will come. That's right. And what color is that new grass?
Green.
It is pretty bright green, isn't it? Yeah, I see little pieces of it.
Is very, very dark green, and when it's super old, it dies, and new grass comes.
When it's super old, it dies. It gets brown. And it's not quite dead. It looks dead, but it's not quite because it keeps living and it keeps turning green in the spring. What else do you see? There are birds flying back. Yes, there are. I keep seeing geese, the big ones, but there's little birds coming back too. Yeah, and I hear them singing new songs all the time. Right outside our church doors, there's things planted in the ground, right in that flower bed. And they're poking their little green shoots up out of the ground. And they're going to be tulips, or they're going to be daffodils, or they're going to be something. I don't know yet, but there's something there, and they're poking their little green heads out. It's kind of fun. So spring is such a wonderful time. There's new things happening all over the place outside, and it's such a fun time to go exploring outside. And we're going to sing a song right now and learn some signs about the beauty of nature and spring and all of that. Of course. Yeah, right after we sing this song. This song is called "Oh Beautiful Gaia." And Gaia is just another name for our planet, for Earth. And so when we're singing this song, we're singing about our Earth and how wonderful it is and beautiful it is. And there's different parts of our planet that we're going to sing about. So Sherry Ann is going to teach us a few things that we need to know about this song. And if I hold the mic, do you just want to lead us through it?
That'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you. Good morning. Okay. So if we're going to be singing about Gaia, we'll need the letter G in, I use American Sign Language. And so the letter G is the first letter of Gaia, which is another way to think about the Earth. So I take my thumb and my pointer finger and I point them out as far as I can, both hands, and I turn them on its side, just like that. And then Earth, or Gaia, turns out in space. And so then we can pretend we're turning Gaia by just moving our hands around each other. And Gaia is so beautiful that this is the action we'll use for beautiful, just like that. Really, you're pointing to you and to everybody you see and saying, oh, beautiful, and all the creatures. And Gaia in space is so beautiful, it's like a jewel or a gemstone. And if you were to point to your finger, pretending you have a ring with a beautiful gemstone on your finger, that would be the action we'll use to show jewel in the cosmos. Gaia is out in this amazing expanding universe, and so we get to show that. As big as you possibly can, and know where your neighbor is so you don't knock them out. And then if you were to look really, really close, and you'd see on Gaia, there are so many things. They are blessed. They are blessed creations, and we'll use a sign, an action that says like this, exactly, they're so great. You start up here, and you can smile and send it out and say, wow, blessed creation. This is the action we'll use for, it's so amazing, everything about living on Gaia. That's creation. And then if you looked really, really close, you would see a lizard on Gaia. And so that's our action for a lizard. It's the letter L, and it climbs up that rock. And you'll see a turtle. You look really close, and a turtle has a body with a head and a shell. And that head sometimes pokes in and pokes out, so you can make it looking around or not. And one last sign that is really important is that we'll use the action for home, because we're home. We are Earth, we're home, and we're living in home, and this is the sign for home. It starts at your chin and goes around to the side of your face. So I think that's probably enough for us to work with.
Great.
And I'd just like to say, actually one more.
Yes.
Our friend Carolyn created this song with friends, and she's sitting at the piano right now. So here's the sign for thank you with love. Exactly. So thank you. With love, Carolyn.
Piece he's entitled, Spring is Mud and Miracle. I'll wax romantic about the splendors of spring in a moment. But first, there's a hard truth to be told. Before spring becomes beautiful, it's plug ugly. Nothing but mud and muck. I've walked through early spring fields that will suck the boots right off your feet. A world so wet and woeful you yearn for the return of snow and ice. Of course, there's a miracle inside that muddy mess. Those fields are a seedbed for rebirth. I love the fact that the word humus, that decayed organic matter that feeds the roots of plants, comes from the same word that gives rise to humility. It's an etymology in which I find forgiveness, blessing, and grace. It reminds me that the humiliating events of life, events that leave mud on my face or make my name mud, can create the fertile soil that nourishes new growth. Spring begins tentatively, but advances with a tenacity that never fails to touch me. The smallest and most tender shoots insist on having their way, pressing up through ground that looked only a few weeks earlier as if it would never grow anything again. The crocuses and snowdrops don't bloom for long, but their mere appearance, however brief, is always a harbinger of hope. And from those small beginnings, hope grows at a geometric rate. The days get longer, the wind gets warmer, and the world grows green again. As my personal winters turn towards spring, I find it hard enough to keep slogging through the mud within. I find it even harder to credit the small harbingers of new life to come, hard to be hopeful until the outcome is secure. Spring teaches me to look more closely within myself and to trust the green tendrils of possibility, the intuitive hunch that may morph into a larger insight, the glance or the touch that may start to thaw a frozen relationship, the stranger's act of kindness that makes the world seem like home again. This is the inspiration of a great student of life. A reading from John's Gospel, a story that has some resonances to another story that comes to us in Luke's Gospel, but has its own particular framework, which we'll explore in a few moments, from John chapter 9. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. He spit on the ground and made mud with his saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes. And he said to him, "Go and wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. The man went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Isn't this the one that used to sit and beg?" Some said he is, some said he wasn't. No, it just looks like him. But he said, "I'm the man." And they kept asking him, "So how were your eyes opened?" And he said, "The man named Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' And I went and washed and received my sight." They brought the man before the Pharisees, that is to say, the religious leaders of the day. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made mud and opened his eyes. The Pharisees asked him how he'd received his sight, and he told them, the man named Jesus put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I can see. But they said to him, well, this man surely isn't of God, for he doesn't even observe the Sabbath. How can he do these sorts of things? And the Pharisees argued and were divided amongst themselves. So they asked the man who'd been born blind, what do you say about this one? It was your eyes that were opened. He said, I think he's a prophet. And then they interrogated the man's parents, who said, why ask us? He's old enough to speak for himself. And a second time they interrogated the man who'd been born blind, and exasperated, he said, I told you already, why ask me again? Do you want to become his disciples? And they mocked him and said, you're his disciple, but we're disciples of Moses. And you're trying to teach us? And they drove him out of the synagogue. This is a story passed down to us from early Jewish Christian community of the first century. And from the poetry of Mary Oliver, her great spring poem entitled Skunk Cabbage. And now as the iron rinds over the ponds start dissolving, you come dreaming of ferns and flowers and new leaves unfolding. You come upon the brash, turnip-hearted skunk cabbage, slinking its bunched leaves up through the chilly mud. You kneel beside it. The smell is lurid and flows out in the most unabashed way, attracting into itself a continual spattering of protein, appalling its rough green caves and the thought of the thick root nested below, stubborn and powerful as instinct. But these are the woods you love, where the secret name of every death is life again. A miracle, wrought surely not of mere turning, but of dense and scalding reenactment. Not tenderness, not longing, but daring and brawn, pulling down the frozen waterfall, the past. Ferns, leaves, flowers, the last supple refinements, elegant and easeful, waiting to rise and flourish. What blazes the trail is not necessarily pretty. These are the insights of a contemporary poet. Some days stand out in the muddle of our memories. For me, one of those days was a spring afternoon when I was 10 years old. I was playing with my 9-year-old cousin in the ditch that ran in front of her home. It was a Good Friday, and our grandfather had died the day before. In the safety of her neighborhood, we were left under the watchful eye of a neighbor who would keep an eye out on us for a few hours while our parents were gone. and we were equipped with our spring toys. A few sticks we'd found on the ground, our rubber boots, and that great and wonderful little thin crust of ice that formed each night on the mud puddles in the ditch. We played all afternoon, breaking up that ice with our sticks and our boots, and then making little channels down the ditch, through the culverts and under the driveways for the water to flow. Well, our parents were in another time in their lives, receiving our grandfather's friends and family. We were just 2 kids. On the cusp of the spring of childhood and adolescence, ankle deep in mud, talking about our dreams for the future, what we wanted to be when we grew up, how we imagined our lives as grown-ups. Wendy imagined herself a nurse. I said I would be a minister. And even though our life work would take us to the very identities we imagined so clearly for ourselves on that spring day, neither of us, with a mere decade of life experience, could possibly begin to know how meandering and muddy the path of life would actually be, and how rare such moments of that childlike clarity there are in life, where we so easily know and name and see. Each spring, mud inaugurates the season that brings me back to that childhood day when I was content to play in the mud, to stand in those cold, muddy waters, when I wasn't rushing the season, but I could actually be present to that great transition of a world that would soon enough burst out of hibernation into 50 shades of green. But as an adult, I'm much less excited to be in the mud. I dread the mud season because it means 4 muddy paws in our house, and it means a driveway that's harder to get out of than when it has ice on it. And I'm among those who are longing for the wonders of that white winter to turn brilliantly green without having to wade through the mud to get there. But at least in our part of the world, it doesn't grow green again without being a muddy mess first. The miracle of spring that is born again and again is born of mud. And it teaches us a spiritual truth. We rarely get to anything new and life-giving without getting filthy, without getting muddy, without slogging and sliding our way through the muddle and through the mess, without giving up our grip on certainty and clarity, without being willing to lose our trail in a puddle. Those who were finding light in the wisdom of Jesus of Nazareth, they learned this truth well. Their writings, some 50 or 60 years after his execution, after the death of their spiritual guide, gives us some insight into the very muddy terrain they found themselves traversing. In that story we heard a moment ago, we hear a narrative that was created in the very murky time in which they found themselves, as they were being expelled from the synagogue because they were no longer Jewish enough. As they were being judged by the religious authorities of their day to have lost the right to identify themselves as Jewish and to take their place in the synagogue because of the way in which they had found light and direction in the teachings of a peasant prophet, Jesus of Nazareth. One that for them had seemed to be illuminated with a radiance for living, moving beyond the laws of Moses, melting the barriers that separated Jew and Gentile, male and female, cultivating a spiritual path that was not about the observance of any particular purity laws and rituals, but was about becoming one human family, loving enemies into friends, building a community of radical equality. And into this time, the writer of John's Gospel created several highly symbolic stories, not stories that happened in history, but stories that transcend history, the way all good archetypal stories do. Stories about things that never happened because they're things that are always happening. The story of a man born blind is the story of so many first-century Jews who were being expelled from their community of faith because of what they had experienced and the way they were seeing the world. In the world of that highly metaphorical story, Jesus makes a poultice of mud and it becomes an instrument of healing for one who never had sight. We miss so much of the possibilities in this story if we read it as some kind of shamanistic healing or some supernatural miracle or something that happened in time and space. It's a symbolic story which shares the experiences of those who had become sighted for a new vision of community, a new vision of spirituality, a new vision of their spiritual practice, who were finding some kind of light beyond the patrons of their past, beyond what they had inherited in Moses and their prophets, who were finding life in reinterpreting and re-envisioning some of their feasts and festivals that they'd inherited from their tradition, who were finding community with those they hadn't been able to associate with before because of their gender or because they weren't circumcised or because they didn't observe certain dietary laws that were prescribed by their priests. In the world of the story, as this character was interrogated and expelled by the religious authorities of his day, he was revealing the experience of those to whom this gospel was written. In their expulsions, in being rejected by the leaders of their religious communities, they were in that muddy transition from clarity that had once defined their lives, as they were becoming excommunicated from their synagogues, but didn't yet have a new name by which to call themselves. They weren't yet claiming that name Christian. They were just people of the way. That was their name for themselves, people of the way, people on a way, people finding a new way. I don't know about you, but often when we move from seeing things one way to seeing things another, we get a bit muddy. When we disturb the waters with our wading, we create a bit of mud. When we challenge the dominant understandings, our name is usually mud before it's anything else. Because we don't get to the extravagance of green without getting our boots muddy. Doesn't happen. In the words of the poet, what blazes the trail is not necessarily pretty. We've witnessed this again and again in our history. In the history of our humanity, in the history of every invention, in the history of science, in the history of every reformation, in the history of every challenge to the status quo, in the history of every freedom and social movement. What blazes the trail is not necessarily pretty. This is a muddy time in the history of our species. In those competing visions that splinter us into capitalists and socialists, into competing values of pluralism and extremism, into competing priorities of economy and environment. It's a messy time when claims of purity exact utter and unspeakable cruelty in Brussels and Paris and Lahore and Syria, to name only the ones that make the headlines. And it's a muddy time for our planet. As we try to move beyond thinking of ourselves to acting on behalf of the future and what is good for all. And it's a muddy time in our own small puddle. The world of the United Church of Canada, which this week, in rejecting the appeal of Greta Vosper to a process created to review her effectiveness as a minister based only on what she is seeing and how she's naming her own quest. Much like the religious leaders in the world of this ancient story, who interrogated the man with muddy eyelids again and again, seeking to hear the answer they wanted to hear, rather than to hear and welcome the truth of his experience. So what spring has ever come without making a mess? The humus of newness generally begins in chaos, in disorder, in disorientation, in the mess. To be faithful to this season in our time as a species, in this season in our faith community, in this season on our planet, to be faithful to this season is to not be afraid to get muddy. To be willing to move through the standing water with courage and wear some mud on a path to greening. As a 21st century spirituality comes out of the puddles of the past. In this messy season in our hemisphere, in our history, can we find the courage to wear some mud? Knowing it's the only way green growth comes. That there's never been the miracle of spring without the misery of mud. And it's a time to ask ourselves, what do we see as we wipe the mud from our eyes? And doesn't what we see determine how we live? At this table, in the midst of the mess and the muddle, we celebrate the unfolding of matter, the emergence of energy, the evolution of life that's brought us to this moment. And at this table, we acknowledge the chaos of creativity, the blessed mess of the mysteries that link us each to each other, to all that is and was and ever will be. In this ritual, we connect with the long story of life, of earth opening to feed us. In gratitude for the solar energy of grain and grape, symbols of that on which our life depends. At this table, we also connect with the traditions of our spiritual ancestors, remembering the festival of Passover and how it was revisioned and infused with new meaning as Jesus gathered with his friends in the midst of the fears they experienced as the empire sought to silence them. We meet at this table remembering how the early community of Jesus sustained their hope and their commitment by sharing meals with each other and by feeding the hungry. We come to this table as an act of solidarity and an act of subversiveness. Solidarity with all who hunger for bread and meaning. Bread for body and bread for spirit. For all who thirst for the essentials of life and, equally essential, the freedom to be. And we gather here in a subversive commitment that challenges the systems that allow hunger to be acceptable and insatiable thirst to be inevitable and abundance to be the province of only some, not all. We share the bread of solidarity and the cup of subversiveness as a way of renewing our commitment to be the human expression of Earth community, the embodiment of compassion and respect, freedom and possibility. You don't need to be a member of this or any church to be welcome at this table. You don't have to subscribe to any particular belief or any doctrine or creed. These are the gifts of a good earth, and they're for all of us.